All right, welcome to Lou's mini series on ACLs. This may be broken up into a few parts. All right, so an ACL is basically an access control list, or also known as ACE, access control entry. So this is a critical part of your firewall foundation. This is where you're going to create rules or access list. Essentially, that's what it is. It's a list of things in order of importance to create access to allow things to connect from one location to another location. So here's Cisco's little way of thinking of this. So we can see that we have the purpose of creating and filtering packets. Yes, that's correct. This can be applied by routers, can be applied by some layer 3 switches, Palo Altos, all these things. So a lot of devices, even host-based firewalls, have ACLs. So yes, every vendor has their own little spin on it, or or complexity levels. So we're going to dive into that, but let's just kind of get into what is an ACL. What are some of the common things that all ACLs have in common? So let's continue forward. So again, they perform these different things. They limit access to networks, so hopefully increase performance. I don't know about that one, but it provides traffic flow control. Yes, it's like going to the TSA. Stand in that line. Stand in that line. Throw your stuff in this line. So it provides our basic level security. Yes, it's kind of like our frontline security because this is what we're going to be allowing access to it. And then we are going, and basically how this works, we're going to either allow or permit or deny people access. So that's the key thing. Permit or deny access. And it is a form of packet filtering. So if we're looking at this, we're looking at basically we're going to be, hitting layer 3 and layer 4 of the OSI model. Yes, in Cisco they have standard and extended, but we're not going to focus on that. We're just going to kind of focus a little bit on ACLs itself. All right, so remember, you got to think about where we're applying this, or where is this being applied at. So we are looking at the network and transport layer. So that's important to keep in mind when we're talking about ACLs. So we apply these ACLs to interfaces. So we apply them. So we have many, not necessarily, I want to say many forms of ACLs, but depending on the vendor and how they apply these ACLs, you could. But you got to think about the perspective where everything's coming in. So are we talking about traffic going from the internet into the DMZ? You also got to think about traffic going out from the DMZ to the internet, the DMZ to the inside of your network, your inside your network to the DMZ. These are all different things you got to take consideration in how these ACLs will operate and define those things. So again, ACLs are applied to interfaces typically. So some ACLs are version 4 only. Some are just dedicated for 4 and 6, and some will do both. Again, depending on the vendor. Again, this is not, a vendor conversation. This is just ACL conversations about how things go. All right. And this big rule down here. Boom. Let me back up for a second. The last ACL is always explicitly denied. That is correct. Don't put that in there. You put that in there, and some ACLs will screw up because, like an example, the Palo Alto has 2 hidden rules. They don't show you. In the newer OSs it does, but the older ones it doesn't show it. And that's important because when you put that in there, it may bypass some hidden rules that are in there. So you don't need to add this in there. but it's you just need to remember that. So when, like an example, when I write out my ACLs, I like to use Excel to put my thoughts down on paper. So I will put this on there, so it just helps me remind me when I'm visually looking at it and saying, "Oh, okay, here's how this stuff flows." All right. So I just want to really point that out because this is what kills people with ACLs. Because the concept of thinking of an ACL kind of goes back to me with Novell and the NT days. NT days is you had to restrict rights. In Novell, you had to give rights away. So when you throw up an ACL, you have to give access because, the last line is I'm denying it. So you got to remember that part. That's a key part. All right. So let's talk about the next part. Wildcards. Because then when you're grouping things again, this is depending on how you're applying things, but you want to group things. Some ECLs you can just say I want to allow this country in or I want to allow this subnet in. So we do have to understand how these things get matched because it is a matching game because you don't want to just match individuals. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. So here are just some examples where here's some different rules where all the octets have to match. Here's the first three octets have to match. Again, here are some of the different basic ones out there that have to match. Again, it's just wildcards. If you look at back in your prompt days, command line CLI using the question mark asterisk, that's what these are. So this is how, depending on how you want to match things. And again, you got to understand other things that we'll talk about in a moment. I just want to go over some of the main concepts and then talk about the next kind of part two of this. All right. So here, Cisco gives a little examples of matching. Again, here we go. We got the 000, so they all match. Cool. So we would create an access list to allow this to go through. All right. Cool. And again, we can write these things differently. Again, depending on which vendor and how their ACL works, this is going to make a difference. All right. So again, just looking at the wildcards again, there are different ways you can write this out. So if you want to allow a subset of an IP address block to go through, you can do that by using, creating different ACLs. All right. So here's some other key terms. You have a host. Host is, is an individual. The term any means anybody. That's a wild card. So a host is an individual. Any is anybody that has an IP can come on in or deny depending on your concept of access. All right. So our next thing when we're thinking about these, we got to think about where we're applying these. So we have to have inbound, outbound rules. You do. You just can't just say, "Hey, I don't care about what's going in." You got to also care about what's going out, because if someone or something, gets attached to your network, you don't want those things necessarily to go out. And so, here's what the book gives, some examples of what's, some best practice on this. All right. I'll see you guys in part two.